And I'm assuming you can see that now. I was just speaking to Carolyn a few minutes ago about trying to interpret what happened in the French elections for legislature 2 days ago, but we'll talk about that later in the course. But we have this France, homeland of liberty in Europe and imperialist power abroad. I got into this recently when I was reading about Algeria, and I realized there's a tremendous struggle even over history in France and in Algeria. And to me, the 18th century has always been home of two wonderful developments. One is the Constitution in the United States, and the other is the French Revolution of 1789 and its message of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I think what I'd like to do is examine that French message both at home and abroad, and we'll see what we mean. First of all, why is PowerPoint? There we go. I just wanted to say who I am. For those who don't know me, I was way back when, in the Middle Ages, I was trained as an historian. This is a book I wrote about a place that most of you have never heard of, Upper Silesia. This is a book that I translated a year or two ago from the Polish. So that's just to say that I'm around. You know, there's a German translation of the book. But first question is, where's France? You read about it in the paper all the time, but I thought we could take a look here just for a second. Here's France over here in Western Europe. And France has so many tourists. I assume that many of you in the audience have been in France as a tourist, at least. But here's France, surrounded here by Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, United Kingdom across the English Channel. That's probably familiar to you in the sense of Western Europe is more familiar than Eastern Europe. Here is what is traditionally the way France is divided into its regions. And they're probably not so official. Well, they are official now, these regions. But when you read French material, they'll talk about the hexagon. Just as we talk about the continental United States, they talk about the hexagon. Here's the hexagon, more or less six-sided. And when we say, what do we mean by France? You know, sometimes we see different things. For example, Brittany, or here it is, Bretagne, has its own culture. And even now, things have remained. We have Alsace and Lorraine have been the object of some wars, 1870, 1914, 1940 to 45. Here's where Alsace is, over in this northeastern region, and here's where Germany would be right here. Provence, down here, southern France, it's got its own culture, its own pronunciation of French. And Paris, or Île-de-France, is the central region, and Paris is at the center of it. 20% of the French population lives there. It's very important in France. I mean, it is the center of many, many things. And just to give you a map that some of you may know, these are traditional areas. You probably know the word, even if you don't know French, you probably know oui, oui for yes. Well, that OU, that's the oui here. And down here, they had a different way of saying oui. That's well, it's called the Occitan area. But there's still some cultural differences. And as I mentioned, Brittany has its own traditions. Alsace still has a German type dialect. Flemish up here in the area bordering Belgium, and Catalan, bordering Spain and Catalonia. So these are these images of France. And France likes to think of itself, even now, as a world country. It has 5 areas which are considered departments, like not exactly a province or state, but they have representatives in the parliament, just like any other department. It's what they call French Guiana here, but it's Guyane, the islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, these small islands, Saint-Pierre, Miquelon, Mayotte Island here, Réunion down here off of the coast of Madagascar. They even have independence movements in New Caledonia. They've had three referendums on independence in the last 20 some years. And it's still controversial. And then they have these other islands. We're not going to go into that detail. But there it is. And we'll see, here is all this area here in Africa. Almost all of these countries are have French as either an official or unofficial language. Not every country, but we'll see that in a little later. I also will mention books that you might want to look at. This is, if you're really interested, it's a very, very good survey of French history. The Colin Jones, Cambridge Illustrated History. It's a paperback that I don't think we have it here in our library, but there it is. Well, let's talk about 1789. It's a name that gets repeated a lot. And it's this revolution of 1789. So why did this happen? You know, the economy was in recession and the nobles were in financial trouble. So what happens is they clamp down. They want more from the people who owe them dues and rents. They're not serfs anymore in the sense that they're chained to the land, but economically they are chained. And you have something called enclosures, which you might be familiar with from England, where small strips of land are put together into one larger group, and you get peasants being pushed off the land. You know, this term that the Marxists like to use, a lumpen proletariat in rags. These are people wandering around looking for work, both rural and urban. And 1789, France is practically going bankrupt. They've been living on loans. And the state decided that they needed new taxes. And they resorted to something called the Estates General, kind of a, not exactly parliament, but let's call it that. And it hadn't met since 1614. So this is not a powerful group until then. The estates, clergy, nobility, the third estate, meaning probably the middle classes, wanted more. And then they have this, what's called the tennis court oath. The king tries to get rid of them. And all these representatives say they're not disbanding until their needs are met. The famous tennis court oath, and this is a painting, and there are many paintings of it. You have this revolution, and you may know that the king was executed in 1792. And then the government is run for 3 years by a committee of public safety, and we have the infamous Maximilien Robespierre, who doesn't hesitate to order the execution of enemies. And I mentioned here that in Algiers, which had been a French colony for 175 years, I get 130 years at that time, they set up something called the Committee of Public Safety. Even the Algerian nationalists are hearkening back to a French tradition. Then in 1795, the Committee of Public Safety is overthrown and you have the Directorate. And this is the small group of people who eventually bring in Napoleon. And that leads to his rise. One of the things they do, and that we still hear about, is the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. And here's a painting. If you look at this, some of you may be familiar in the Jewish tradition. This sure looks like the Ten Commandments to me in that painting. And here are examples. Article 1, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. In Article 2, the natural and eternal rights of man include liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Article 7, no person shall be accused, arrested, or imprisoned except in those cases established by law. This should be familiar with this from the American Constitution. Article 9, every person is presumed innocent until declared guilty. Now, all of this sounds great. I mean, we're going to have a new society and we're going to have all these things, at least for men. I mean, women take a long time to get equality in France, but even for men it took a while. And I just want to show you here, this is a painting 1789. In 2022, you go to the website of the Supreme Constitutional Council of France, and there it is. I mean, they still hearken back to this tradition as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. That's what it says right here in French. And this is still sort of this holy declaration. It's not a book, but it's a holy declaration. Well, what does it mean to have liberty, equality, and fraternity? It was first pronounced in the writings of Robespierre, 1790, even though he becomes a sort of a quasi-dictator, he still was, for him, he wanted to impose liberty, equality, and fraternity. In 1793, the slogan goes on all public buildings. And there it is in French, liberté, égalité, fraternité, ou la mort, liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. Gruesome, right? There it is. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, ou la mort. Unity, and the rest of it says unity, indivisibility of the Republic, and this is the cap. That's traditionally the image of the French Revolutionary. Well, what's interesting is that slogan isn't adopted officially until 1848 by what's called the Second Republic. Why is it the second? We'll talk in a few minutes. And then it falls out of fashion. Then in 1879, the Third Republic adopts liberty, equality, fraternity. They dropped the death part. And now it's, official for France. Actually, here it is. Haiti in 1987. The national slogan, liberty, equality, fraternity. And in just a few minutes, we'll see the connection between Haiti and France. The Catholic Church didn't like the motto. I mean, there's always been a struggle of the Catholic Church with the French heritage of the French Revolution and what the French call secularism. But in 1980, finally, Pope John Paul II says, "What haven't the sons and daughters of your nation done for the understanding of mankind to express its inalienable rights? We are all aware of the place of the idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity in your culture and your history." Well, as I say, it's worked its way into the vocabulary and the consciousness of France. And here we have, I think that's the doorway of a school. The French Republic, liberty, equality, fraternity, still there. I mean, we may or may not accept it, just like in the United States, we have all these slogans that we just automatically put up, but it's still there. Well, there's some themes of the revolution that are still current in France. And it's a weird one. In Grenoble, May, just a month ago, there's this fight over bathing suits where Muslims want to have a more modest bathing suits. And you have Laurent Wauquiez, or Wauquiez, I mean, it isn't clear to me how you pronounce his name. It's a real right-winger. And by allowing the burkini, the French are submitting to Islamism, he says. I mean, that's the burkini, you know. In American culture, it's totally unremarkable. But the idea is for Muslim women to be modest on the beach. And then we have, here's this vocabulary again. Why should we publish people who wish to be modest? Why do men always have an opinion about the way women dress? France is liberté, égalité, fraternité. Let's let women be free and guarantee them free access. So that's, you know, obviously a woman saying, what is this silly controversy? But here you have, 2016, the police in Cannes closing in on a vicious criminal, a woman wearing a burkini on the beach. In Le Monde last month, the mayor of the town of Rennes he sidesteps polemics because he said, well, we should allow the burkini in the municipal swimming pools. Now, I mean, this is really something that is controversial in France, the burkini, because the whole place of Islam in France is at issue, but this is what has become the item. And it's a little strange to think of this as modesty. The core of the debate is about secularism, in French, laïcité, and that's such a big topic in France. We'll come back to it. In the United States, we talk about the separation of church and state, but in France, it's more than the separation of church and state. There's a desire to ban religious symbols in public places, any kind of religious symbol, although it currently takes its origin in its suspicion of Islam. By the way,
could I make a brief comment here, Larry, from my brother who lives in France, who explained to me the difference between separation of church and state in the United States and in France?
Go ahead.
Our idea, since the United States was founded by a bunch of dissenting sects, was to protect religion from the overarching hand of government. The French Revolution came against a very powerful church. So the idea is to protect the public sphere against religion. And so that where the two basic ideas of separation of church and state are quite different in their foundation.
Yes, it's certainly true. And we'll come back to that because I think it's a very important issue. But I just give you this picture of the monokini to say that we're not talking about modesty in the attack on the burkini. That's an example, you know, it's a bare top. That's the monokini. Very amused. I was very amused to see that. Okay, let's go back to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Another symbol that most of you, I suspect, have heard at least the name, the Marseillaise, you know, Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Arise, children of the fatherland, the day of glory has arrived. And then you see the text here. It's a pretty tough text about against us, tyranny's bloody standard is raised. Do you hear in the countryside the roar of those ferocious soldiers? They're coming right into your arms to cut the throats of your sons or women. These are invaders mainly from Germany in 1792. To arms, citizens, form your battalions. march, march, let an impure blood water our furrows. So it's a pretty aggressive national anthem, although, people just sing the words. But here you have a picture of the French National Assembly. And we'll see again, this is where we have gotten our terms of who's on the left and who's on the right. That's how they divide it in the assembly. You see, here's the speaker here on the left side. And the left, people who were later called the Jacobins. And on the right, people who are more conservative. My point here is how much these traditions have lasted. And here you have Marseillaise. It's adopted in 1795. In 1815, when Napoleon was defeated, they dropped it. And in 1879, they readopted it. And if you remember from a few minutes ago, that the liberty, equality, and fraternity motto wasn't adopted again until the 1870s. So these are not as long ago as 1789, where all of a sudden everything changed. I went backwards, didn't I? Sorry. The history of the revolution of 1789, liberty and equality and fraternity, you have what's called the First Republic. It's declared in 1792 when the king is executed. And it lasts for that period. And here is an image of Robespierre overseeing the guillotining of an enemy. And what I thought here is just give you a fast overview of the different forms of government. Here's Napoleon becomes emperor. And there is this famous picture of his about having adopted the dress of what he considered an emperor. And then you get a new king, Louis XVIII, after Napoleon is defeated. It's called the Restoration. And Louis XVIII is not the only king in that period. There's a revolution in 1830, and we get Louis Philippe, who's called the bourgeois monarch. 1848, revolution, 1848 to 51, and then you get Napoleon III. He's I think a first cousin once removed. I've forgotten his relationship to Napoleon I. But there he is. Then you have what's called the Third Republic, 1870 to 1940. And in the 1870s, there's a man named Léon Gambetta. And in the 1930s, Léon Blum. We'll see why Blum becomes such a controversial figure in French politics in the 1930s. Vichy France, that's the France that we consider to be under the thumb of the Nazis, and Marshal Pétain is the nominal head of government and then they keep coming, the Fourth Republic, 1945 to 58. De Gaulle is at first the head of the republic, and then he quits in the late 40s because he's disgusted at the parliamentary maneuverings, and he finally instigates the Fifth Republic. And, Emmanuel Macron was reelected president of the Fifth Republic just a few weeks ago. Each of these republics, each time you have a new constitution, there was this old joke about someone going into this venerable bookseller in Paris and asks for a copy of the French Constitution. And the response of this proud man was, "We don't deal in periodic literature." This is to suggest that there are continuing differences in France. Here, this one on the left is 1791. When they say non-juror clergy, that means clergy who do not pledge allegiance to the new French government. This is Brittany over here. It's been a stronghold of what's considered the right wing. This is the North, and then in the rural South, and then This is on the border with Spain here. And look at the late 20th century. Religious observance, I've forgotten how they measure it. They have odd ways. But anyway, the point is, look at the similarities between these areas. Here's, for example, Brittany here in 1791, religious observance, Brittany, late 20th century. Alsace-Lorraine over here, Alsace-Lorraine over here, and so on, here, rural France. And then if you look at right-wing stronghold, this is a 1975 election, amazingly similar. Not just Brittany here, but other areas, Normandy and other areas down here, rural France, the right-wing stronghold on the border with Spain, Alsace-Lorraine. Some differences in the presidential election, because you may be familiar with Marine Le Pen, sort of in American terms, she'd be a Donald Trump type figure. And in this case, the yellow are the areas that have voted in majority for Macron. And even Brittany, infamous Brittany, votes for him, but still Le Pen is strong up north and in the south down here and in Corsica. And these are the overseas areas. For whatever reason, all of them resent the current administration in France. And most of them are voting for Le Pen. Well, now let's go back and see how this notion of liberty, equality, and fraternity plays out in some French possessions. Let's take slavery, which, as you know, hung on in the United States until the end of the Civil War and informally afterwards. In England, it's abolished in the 1830s. In France, in the 17th and 18th century, it exists in some coastal settlements in America and some islands in the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean, especially Santo Domingo, you know, what later becomes Haiti. Slavery is there. In France, you have a rule of habeas corpus. No torture is allowed. At the same time, in the colonial areas, slavery exists. They all belong to France, but there's an extremely profitable slave trade. And this goes back to the 17th century. Slavery is officially recognized in 1643 because they use those slaves to raise cane sugar in the Caribbean. It's a very profitable trade. And so you have slavery in the East Indies, that's all, you know, in the Indian Ocean, the West Indies, that's the Caribbean, and Senegal, which is larger than the current country of Senegal, but a large section of West Africa. You even have something called the Black Code, the Code Noir. There it is. The date on that is 1742. It started in 1645. It started. I'm just reading the Latin date of this publication. But this talks about the conditions of slavery. You know, first of all, it restricted the activities of even free people of color. There were a number of them, more than in the English colonies. It mandated the conversion of all slaves to Roman Catholicism. It defined punishment, outlawed the worst punishments, ordered the expulsion of all Jews from the colonies because they're sworn enemies of the Christian faith. There are not a lot of Jews there, but for whatever reason, they become a topic, and we'll see it as we go on. In Guadeloupe, an island in the Caribbean, you know, just near the coast of South America, the number of slaves from 1556 to 1710 triples. And you're not talking about a big population. Or here's Martinique. In 1745, Out of 80,000 inhabitants, there's 65,000 slaves. So this is on the eve of the revolution, very extensive slavery in various French holdings. And what's the difference between a slave and a serf? Well, in theory, a serf is tied to the land and you can't be sold the way a slave can be. But there are a number of requirements that are not too different. Well, what happens in 1789? You would think that with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, we're going to do away with slavery. Well, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, if I were the chief of one of the peoples of what he calls la nigrité, I declare that I would set up power at the border and would hang the first European who would dare to enter. And Montesquieu, to whom we all look at as a great Enlightenment thinker, he says, slavery is contrary to natural law. Well, all that may be true in what they said. And at the beginning of the revolution, there were some deputies who demanded the abolition of slavery. After all, Article 1 of the Rights of Man, its Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen says, men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. What? Well, you have slavery. This is what's an image of slavery. And despite the efforts of these deputies, the principles of 1789 are not extended to the colonies. And here's an image of what's going on. Very profitable, harvesting, in this case, cane sugar. In 1791, citizenship is granted to anyone born of free parents, and it's violently protested by the colonists. And that protest hangs on. And what I'm calling here the Violetta Plan in Algeria in 1937 to extend citizenship rights to a very restricted minority of Muslims was violently protested. So that's as late as 1937. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. It's okay at home, but we got to be careful abroad. So that decree of 1791 is rescinded for the colonies. And there are various attempts to abolish slavery, but it's always torpedoed by the colonists. And in the colonies is vicious punishment. There's a horrible example of the kind of punishment that might be meted out to slaves. Slavery was abolished in 1794, reestablished by Napoleon in 1802. Napoleon is the great emancipator in the image, but not in the colonies. And the final abolition is 1848. Take a look at Saint-Domingue, Haiti. In 1791, you have the first armed Black insurrection by thousands of slaves. And up until 1802, you have de facto independence. And here's a man who has become, it's not a saint because of the secular state, but Toussaint Louverture. At first, he sided with the French when slavery was abolished in 1795 temporarily. Here's this image of Toussaint Louverture. He himself was born enslaved. Then in the French Revolution, he's inspired and becomes a Jacobin, that is one of the more radical revolutionaries. And he started out calling for better conditions for slaves, but then he started calling for complete freedom. Here's a statement. Brothers and friends, I am Toussaint Louverture. Perhaps my name has made itself known to you. I have undertaken vengeance. I want liberty and equality to reign in Saint-Domingue. I am working to make that happen. Unite yourselves to us, brothers, and fight with us for the same cause. Well, he was made governor general for life, and then in 1802, the French invited him to parley and arrested him. He died in jail. But the revolution continued under a man named Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The French suffered terrible losses, both in battles and yellow fever. And in 1804, independence was granted. So we have the first former slave established republic. And everyone looked to Haiti as this great tradition. However, there's this ongoing legend. Oh, I meant to show you this here. This Haiti, as you see there, a drama of the Black Napoleon. This is this image that continued to exist. But New York Times, May 17, 2022, is an expose. Here's this picture. It says, in 1791, the Haitian slaves succeeded with what had been incomprehensible before. They chased the French colonists away and founded a new country, right? Here's Haiti. It's now Haiti. Here's the Dominican Republic. It's half of the same island. However, this is again from the Times. It's just astounding, and the Times has been publishing this now. 2 decades after Haiti won its independence from France, Charles X, who was his king, sends squadrons of worship. He said, pay us off, or else we're coming to invade you again. Initially, Charles X had been portrayed as a true liberator of the Haitian people. But there's a different story. Here's what the Times looked at. They revealed a debt so large and so lasting that it could help cement Haiti's paths to poverty and underdevelopment. This is Haiti, even now, considered one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. It became the first and only country where the descendants of enslaved people paid the families of their former masters for generations. I'm not sure if it's the first and only country, but let's say it did happen. And the Times goes on to say that they paid about $560 million in today's dollars, and that some economists said that if Haiti had not been forced to pay the double debt, the country could have mirrored the growth rate of its neighbors across Latin America. The Times estimates $115 billion loss. And it wasn't paid by the elite, it was paid by the little coffee farmers in taxes. And by 1911, $2.53 out of every $3 earned from coffee taxes went to pay French investors. Well, 1914, the American interests got involved. And the Bank of New York pushed for American control. The US stole all the gold from Haiti. And from 1914 on, it's the American banks who are dominating the Haitian economy. Let me go. Some of you are familiar with Haiti and the kinds of both political and economic and the climatic catastrophes that it has suffered. But I just want to review this because there's so many different names for French governments. So they had 4 styles of monarchy. And before the French Revolution, then 1789 to 92 is Louis the 14th is in, Louis the 16th is in jail. Then you have the Restoration with Louis the 18th, then the bourgeois monarchy. They had 2 republics, that's how they count them, from 1790s, and then in 1848 to 52. 2 empires, Napoleon I, Napoleon III, and then 3 republics after the 1852. From the 1870s to the Second World War, after the Second World War, and then here's the 5th Republic. It exists now. We have a quasi-military dictatorship. That was Marshal Pétain. and then what's called a dictatorship by consent, complete Nazi rule, and an attempted coup d'etat revolution in 1958. And that's by the dissatisfied Algerians. So here you have the colonies coming back again. And we'll talk about Algeria. It's so important for the French consciousness. And here's our image of France, a country continually protesting, and it certainly is a tradition. What about Napoleon? I'd like to review some of this. He rose through the army. He saved the Directory, 1795 to 99, by using the armed forces. And here's this famous painting of Napoleon, presumably crossing the Alps, where in fact, I think he crossed on a mule, not on a horse. He becomes what's called the first consul in 1799. And going back to our theme of imperialism, he led an invasion of Egypt. Now, why would they invade Egypt? It was 1797. He says, as soon as he had conquered Egypt, he will establish relations with the Indian princes, and together with them attack the English in their possessions. So one of his aims is to fight the English, but he also has intellectual aims. It's a strange, for us, a strange combination. I mean, the invaders include 167 scientists and other kinds of professors. They discover the Rosetta Stone, which later becomes our key to understanding hieroglyphics. But they do a lot of other scientific studies. They easily defeat the Mamluks, the rulers of Egypt. They invade southern Syria, not successfully, but the interest in Syria will continue into the 20th century. What happens is the British destroy the French fleet, and Napoleon runs away to France, leaving many French soldiers there. But what you see here is an ongoing French interest in controlling Egypt. And that conflict with the British continues till the end of the 19th century. And we will see, such as if you're familiar with the attack on the Suez Canal in 1956, the British and the French continued to have interest there. And this is the image that we had before of Napoleon. He comes home from Egypt and he wins a plebiscite. He becomes, quote, dictatorship by plebiscite. And you have a series of wars in Europe. And the question is this imperialism? Here's on the attack. As you're probably aware, they invade Russia and are sorely defeated. They think up to 90% of his army died in that war. Is it imperialism? And generally, we think of imperialism as being countries outside of Europe. And inside of Europe, it's, I don't know what we call it, it's wars between countries, but there are similarities. There's a decline of religious tolerance. And here, use the example here of the Jewish communities. And even though they're small, they're significant in certain ways. Napoleon, in 1807, calls what he calls the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin goes back 2,000 years to Jewish scholars who are also administrators in Judea. So he has several, 12 questions, which seem a little funny to us, but they're really questions that people like Napoleon and non-Jews had. Is it lawful for Jews to have more than one wife? Is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? They're asking these questions. Does Jewish law order that the Jews should only intermarry among themselves? What does Jewish law say about dealing with Frenchmen? Number 6, do the Jews born in France who are treated as French citizens, acknowledge France as their country. I mean, this says there's a suspicion that if you're Jewish, you can't be a Frenchman. Are they bound to defend it? Are they bound to obey the laws and follow the directions of the civil code? Are they regulated by Jewish law, or are they only sanctioned by custom? These are questions that seem so beyond our notion of what a modern country is. I say that they don't understand how they relate to Jews, and even some of the Jews didn't know how to respond. But here's the call for the Sanhedrin, 1807, in French and in a kind of Hebrew. So the Jews who are really worried, one of the things they say, every Israelite is religiously bound to consider his non-Jewish fellow citizens as brothers and to aid, protect, and love them as though they were co-religionists. And number 6, the Israelite is required to consider the land of his birth or adoption as his fatherland and shall love and defend it when called upon. So they're saying that they are true Frenchmen and that there's no reason to have any doubts about their loyalty to France. And here you have this famous image of Napoleon the Emperor granting citizenship to French Jews with these, you see these Jewish symbols, 10 Commandments, the menorah. And there are some measures improving condition of the Jews, but if you recall, Jews are limited in their occupations. Many of them are money lenders. And in 1808, the infamous decree sort of impoverishes large numbers of Jews by wiping out so many of the debts, especially of rural people. So why is it important to talk about the extension of rights to Jews if we're talking about slavery or imperialism? This topic reemerges in Algeria, in Morocco, in the 20th century, that somehow there is this notion that France, ostensibly a secular state, still has certain Christian traditions, and they're very suspicious of Jews. And we will see in the next class how this plays out in what's called the Dreyfus Affair at the end of the 19th century. And in the 1940s, there is a very strong movement of anti-Semitism where the Vichy government collaborates with the Nazis, and there's very strong evidence that they supported independently the roundup and deportation of Jews. And now there's this current suspicion of Islam. They're worried about Islamic terrorists, but this becomes translated into anything associated with Islam is suspect. And we saw that with the Burkini, and we'll see it again. Here in this case, demonstrators in France, solidarity with French Jews. This sign says, "J'accuse," I accuse. We'll see it, that goes back to 1898, and here in 2022, they're still using that slogan. And we'll see what it is when we talk about the Dreyfus Affair. So what about the French Empire? Napoleon in Egypt, Napoleonic France versus Europe. And here is, in Europe, the greatest extent of the French Empire. They conquered Spain, they conquered Italy, Austria, parts of Dalmatia, march into Poland, where, by the way, Napoleon is seen as the great liberator. That's the greatest extent of that empire. The Low Countries are up here, Belgium, Netherlands. In 1830, this is after Napoleon, the French invade Algeria, which becomes a monumental event in French history. And we'll come back to Algeria. Indochina, they invade in the 1850s and becomes important for them. After all, Vietnam is when the US tried to take over the French possession in Indochina. So that lasts for, well, if we say that the war, American war in Vietnam ended in 1975, so we have 125 years of French, later American involvement there. We have what is called the scramble for Africa, 1880s and 90s, by various colonial powers. In between the two world wars, France again is trying to get a hold of Syria, exercise control in parts of West Africa. Finally, they got out of China, Indochina in 1954. You have a war in Algeria. All these things we're going to talk about here, just trying to give you that image of how this stuff has continued. I mean, it's not a matter just of 1789. This continues. The French liberate almost all their colonies in West Africa in the 1950s. But today we have what are called in English, drum cum, and the drum are the overseas departments and regions, and the cum are the overseas collectivities. So the drum are things like Guyana in South America, Guadeloupe and Martinique, both in the Caribbean. I'm not sure I got that far. They spell Caribbean in two different ways. I wouldn't spell it that way in English in either way. The islands of Réunion and Mayotte. And then there are these collectivities, French Polynesia, the various islands around the world. And then there's a special status for New Caledonia. So these are remnants of the empire, but these 5 places are considered departments of metropolitan France. And that's my slides for read that overseas French citizens in North America have represented